There is a specific kind of relationship you can only have with a neighbor. You know their face. You know which floor they live on, roughly what time they leave in the morning, whether they take the stairs or the elevator. You know the sound of their footsteps, the particular rhythm of their front door closing. You absorb these details without trying to, the way you absorb the smell of the hallway or the specific creak of the third step on the staircase. It becomes background noise, part of the architecture. But you do not know their name. Not their full name anyway. Maybe one of them, if you happen to catch it somewhere. You do not know what they do for work, or whether they have family, or what their apartment looks like on the inside. You do not know if they are happy or miserable, or somewhere in the long gray stretch between those two things. You have shared a wall, a ceiling, a floor with this person for months or years, and the truth is that if they disappeared tomorrow, you would notice the absence before you notice the grief. That is just how it is with neighbors. There is an unspoken agreement that you exist in proximity to each other without ever fully acknowledging it. I have lived in this building for about 3 years. I moved in after my divorce, which was not dramatic or particularly painful by the time it was finished. Just long, the way some things drag on past the point where they mean anything. I needed a place that was affordable and close to work, and did not require me to make any decisions about furniture or paint colors, or whether the kitchen was really big enough. This apartment checked every one of those boxes. 2 bedrooms, which I did not need, but the rent was reasonable. 3rd floor, corner unit. The building itself is the kind that gets described as charming in rental listings because it is old and has original hardwood floors and tall windows. But what that really means is that the pipes knock in the winter, and the walls are thin, and the elevator takes about 40 seconds longer than it should. It is clean. The lobby has a row of metal mailboxes along one wall, each one labeled in different handwriting, different levels of care. Some people have typed their names on little strips of paper. Some have written them in marker directly on the metal. Some have nothing at all. I knew the woman above me the way you know all your neighbors in a building like this. By routine, by residue. She was in her 60s, or maybe older, it was hard to say. Thin in the way that suggested she had always been thin, rather than the way that suggests something is wrong. Though after a while, I stopped being sure of the distinction. Her hair was gray and sparse, kept short and flat against her head. Her hands shook slightly when she held the leash. Her eyes were set deep, shadowed in a way that made her look permanently tired or permanently suspicious, or both. She had a small dog, a terrier of some kind, wiry and alert, that she walked every morning before most people in the building were awake. Her name was on her mailbox. I will call her Mrs. Varelli here, though that is not her real name. In 3 years, she had never once acknowledged me. Not a nod in the lobby, not a glance in the elevator. The one time I said good morning to her, she walked past me without any change in expression, not unfriendly exactly, just completely absent, as if I had not made a sound at all. I assumed she was the type of person who kept to herself. Some people are like that, especially older people who have lived alone long enough that other people have stopped registering as interactive objects and started registering more like furniture. You move around them. You do not expect a response. I did not think much about her beyond that, and she was upstairs. I was downstairs. That was the extent of it. The noise started in late autumn. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it did not start as something alarming. It started as something annoying. There is a significant difference, and the distinction matters. The first time I really noticed it was on a Tuesday night, sometime after 11. I had been in bed for about 20 minutes, not quite asleep, but close, on that particular kind of drowsy stillness where you are aware of your own breathing and the sheets feel heavier than they did. Then the ceiling started. Not a crash, not a bang, just footsteps. Heavy for an older woman, heavier than I would have expected, moving back and forth across the room directly above my bedroom. Slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. I lay there listening to it for a few minutes, and then it stopped, and I fell asleep and did not think about it again until it happened 2 nights later. Same time, roughly. Same ceiling. Same slow, heavy pacing. I started sleeping with a white noise app on my phone. It helped for a while. What I could not tune out was the television. That came a week or 2 later, and it was a different category of noise entirely. Not footsteps, which you can almost rationalize, but sound. Actual broadcast sound. Voices and music and the particular compressed audio of television at high volume, bleeding down through the floor above and into my ceiling and into my living room and bedroom at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, sometimes later. It was not any single channel. That was the thing that started to bother me after a while, in a low-level background way I did not fully examine. One night, it sounded like a news program. Another night, it was something with a lot of music. Once, clearly, it was a children's program. Cartoons, the kind with very loud, very bright incidental music. At 2:30 in the morning, I told myself she had grandchildren visiting. It made sense. Children sleep badly in unfamiliar places, and old people sometimes do not sleep much at all. And maybe she was just keeping them company. I constructed this explanation, and it satisfied me enough to stop looking for another one. What I could not keep explaining away was the stomping. Stomping is different from pacing. Pacing is methodical. Stomping is chaotic. It does not have a direction. It starts in one part of the ceiling and moves to another, and then stops and starts again somewhere else, without any pattern you can follow. It is the sound of children running, of someone playing a game that requires a lot of movement. At 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, on a weeknight when I had to be at work by 8, it was genuinely difficult to absorb without starting to feel a low, steady irritation that built up over consecutive nights into something sharper. I put up with it for about 2 weeks before I did anything. It was a Thursday night, closer to 4 in the morning than to midnight, and the television was going at full volume, and there had been stomping for the past 45 minutes, and I had been lying in bed with my eyes open long enough that I had given up on sleep and was just lying there thinking about how tired I was going to be at work. I got up. I turned on the kitchen light. I stood in the middle of the kitchen floor for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling in my kitchen is about 9 feet. I am 5'11". I got up on the kitchen table, which gave me enough height to reach it, and I knocked on the plaster. 3 slow knocks, firm enough to carry. The television kept going for another 10 or 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I stayed on the table. I was aware of how strange I probably looked, standing on my own kitchen table at 4 a.m. in a t-shirt and sweatpants, knocking on my ceiling. I waited. The apartment above me was quiet. I said, loud enough to carry through the floor, that it was 4 a.m. and I needed her to please stop. Then her voice came down through the floor. Muffled but audible, the particular way sound travels between thin floors in an old building. Conversational, unhurried, not defensive or apologetic. She asked if I had knocked on the ceiling. I said yes. She said she bet I had to get on a table to reach it. It was such an unexpected response that for a moment, I just stood there. Then I told her that yes, that was correct, and that I was still on the table. I told her that anger would do that to a person. She asked if I was on the table right now. I said yes. I was lying. I had already stepped down, but I did not know why I said it. Something about the exchange had shifted slightly, away from complaint and towards something else, something that felt almost like a game, and the instinct was to stay in it rather than end it. She did not respond after that. The television did not come back on that night. A few nights later, there was a loud noise from my apartment. A cabinet door I closed harder than I meant to, and her voice came through the ceiling asking what I was doing. Not annoyed, just asking. I told her I was making a sandwich. She said she had figured I was punching the walls over some sports result. I told her I did not watch sports. She said that was probably for the best. It went on like that for a while. Small exchanges, a noise, and then a guess from above, usually delivered with a dryness that I found genuinely funny. She had that particular kind of humor that works through understatement, the kind that older people sometimes develop when they have been paying attention to the world for long enough to find most of it slightly ridiculous. I started looking forward to it, in a way I did not fully admit to myself at the time. I called her grandma, half teasing. She told me not to call her that. I kept doing it. She did not really object after the first couple of times. What I noticed, somewhere in the back of my mind in a way I did not follow up on, was that I never saw her in the building during any of this. Not in the morning. Not in the lobby. She walked the dog before dawn, and I sometimes caught a glimpse of her from my window, the thin figure in her coat moving slowly across the parking lot below, the small terrier pulling at the leash. But in the building itself, in the elevator or the hallway, I stopped running into her. I did not think about this for very long. People have routines, old people especially. I told myself she probably timed her comings and goings to avoid the parts of the day when the building was busier. The voice through the ceiling was enough. The pattern was familiar, and it was enough. I want to be honest about that, now that I can look back at it. The pattern was familiar, and I liked it. And liking something is one of the more reliable ways to stop looking at it clearly. The exchange that changed everything happened on a night I had not been able to sleep anyway. It was around 2 a.m. I had been awake for about an hour, not because of any noise from upstairs, just the ordinary restlessness that comes with having too much on your mind and not enough to show for it. Work had been difficult that week. Nothing dramatic, just the cumulative weight of small frustrations that do not resolve themselves and instead stack up until they become something heavier than any individual piece deserves to be. I was lying on my couch with the lamp off and the television off, and the room lit only by the ambient glow that comes through the windows in any city building at night. That particular gray-orange that is never quite dark. Her voice came through the ceiling, low and casual, asking if I could not sleep. I told her not to call me Kitty. She said she was not that old. I told her she was. She told me not to push it, and she used my name, or the name I will use here. She said she would come down there and beat my ass. The delivery was completely flat, the kind of threat that is clearly not a threat, that lands more like a punchline to a joke that has been running long enough that you do not need the setup anymore. I told her I would like to see her try. Then nothing. The building settled into the quiet it gets at that hour, that particular compressed silence where you become aware of how few sounds there actually are. No television, no footsteps. The pipes clicked somewhere down the hall, the way they always did when the heat was running. I had assumed she had fallen asleep mid-conversation, which happens sometimes with older people, or so I assumed. I was about to close my eyes when I heard the knock at my door. Not loud, and that is the first thing I want to make clear, because it matters. It was not the knock of someone who needs urgent help, not the frantic knock of an emergency. It was measured. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, with a patience to them that was somehow worse than urgency would have been. The kind of knock that suggests the person on the other side has all the time in the world. I lay still for a moment. My apartment building is not a dangerous place, exactly, but a knock at 2 a.m. is never straightforwardly good news regardless of where you live. I ran through the possibilities quickly. A neighbor with a problem. Someone who had the wrong door. A building maintenance issue I had not been notified about. The knock came again. Same rhythm. Same patience. I got up slowly and crossed the apartment in the dark without turning on any lights, which I cannot fully explain, except that it felt like the right instinct to not announce myself before I had to. I moved to the door and stopped. There was no sound from the other side, no shuffling, no breathing I could detect, no muttering, just the hallway. Then her voice came through the door, hushed, pulled thin the way voices get when someone is speaking quietly and very close to a surface. She asked if I was pretending not to be home. Something about hearing her voice at door level rather than above me. Something about the shift in geometry made the hair on my arms rise in a way I noticed and then immediately tried to rationalize. I told her, through the door, that I was not interested, that I did not want her to get the wrong idea. There was a pause, and then she said something that should have been reassuring and was not. She said she was not into me, not even slightly. She just wanted to play hide and seek. The phrasing sat wrong, the flatness of it, the specific words, hide and seek. From a woman in her 60s, through a closed door at 2 a.m. I told her no, through the door. No thanks. The voice shifted. Something in the texture of it changed in a way I am not sure I can describe precisely without reaching for language that sounds overdramatic. So I will just say that the quality of it altered. It stretched slightly, the way recorded audio sounds when you slow it down just a fraction, just enough to notice without being able to name what is different. She asked if I was holding my breath. She said she could tell. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, or it appeared empty. The fisheye lens of a peephole does not give you a complete picture. There is always a narrow margin on either side that you cannot see. But the hallway directly in front of my door, the section of it that should have held a 60-year-old woman who had just knocked and was speaking close enough to the wood that I could hear her clearly, was vacant. And her voice was still there, still talking, still right at door level. Then she began to sing. I have tried a few times since then to describe what it was like to hear that, and I have not done a very good job. It was not loud. It did not start dramatically. It crept in at the volume of the conversation we had just been having, quiet and close, as if it were a natural continuation of what she had been saying. The melody was simple, the kind of simple that does not feel constructed so much as found, like it had always existed and she was just using it. The words were about a bathroom, about bare feet on tile, about a mirror, about lights being off and eyes still seeing, about something standing in the place where you would stand. By the time I understood what I was hearing, I was already several steps back from the door. I had not decided to move. My body had made that decision separately, and I had caught up to it somewhere in the middle of the kitchen. She kept going. The song shifted to something about a lock being checked twice. Once for fear, she said, and once for something else. I told her to stop, or I was calling the police. The singing stopped. I went back to the peephole and stayed there for a long time. The hallway remained empty for as long as I watched it. I do not know how long that was. Long enough that my eye ached from being pressed against the cold metal. She was not there. Whoever had been standing at my door and speaking and singing had moved, and I had not heard footsteps, had not heard the sound of the stairwell door, had not heard the elevator. I did not sleep that night. When the gray morning light started coming through the windows, I was still sitting with my back against the kitchen wall, facing the door. I heard the elevator open down the hall, the particular sound it makes, the scrape of the doors. And then, through my window, I watched her in the parking lot below, Mrs. Varelli and the small terrier, moving at the same slow pace as every other morning, in the same direction, with the same lack of urgency. In the flat morning light, she looked exactly like what she had always looked like. A tired old woman walking her dog before the day started. I watched her until she turned the corner and disappeared. I got dressed and went to work. I was late. I did not mention to anyone what had happened, because there was no version of it that came out sounding like anything other than a man who had frightened himself listening to his elderly neighbor, and I did not want to be that. It was 2 days later that I ran into Sandra. I want to be careful here too about how I describe Sandra, because she matters to what came after, and I do not want to make her into more of a device than she was. She is a real person who lived on my floor and who I had spoken to maybe 4 times in passing over the course of 2 years. Late 20s, work something in healthcare. I never knew exactly what. Quiet the way some people are quiet, in a way that reads as private rather than unfriendly. I caught her in the hallway between the elevator and her door. I was coming in from work, still wearing my coat, and I had spent 2 days carrying what had happened at my door and not saying it to anyone. And something about seeing a familiar face at close range made the pressure of it release before I had time to think about whether I wanted it to. I stopped her. I realize now that I grabbed her arm, and I should not have done that. It was not the right instinct, but I was running on 2 days of bad sleep and the particular kind of low agitation that comes from knowing something is wrong and not having anyone to say it to. She went still in the way people go still when they are afraid. He fully controlled, very quiet. I let go immediately and stepped back and told her I was sorry. She asked if I was all right. I told her about the noise from above my apartment, the television, the stomping, the voice through the ceiling. I told her about the knock at my door. I left the singing in because I did not know how to leave it out without the rest of it making less sense. I told her I thought I had become something like friends with Mrs. Varelli over the past few weeks, and that whatever happened 2 nights ago had changed that reading significantly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Mrs. Varelli's name like a question. I said yes. The woman above me. Thin hair, walks the dog. Sandra looked at me for a long moment in a way that I could not read immediately. Not like I was wrong, but like she was trying to work out how to say something that required care. She told me that Mrs. Varelli was deaf and mute. She said it slowly, and she watched my face while she said it. The way you watch someone's face when you are delivering information you know will require them to rearrange something. Completely deaf, she said, and had not been able to speak since a medical event several years ago. Her daughter had mentioned it to a few people in the building not long after Mrs. Varelli moved in, as context, because people had sometimes tried to speak to her and been confused or offended by the lack of response. It was not rudeness. She simply could not hear them and could not answer. She had never once acknowledged me in the lobby, I remembered. Not a nod, not a glance, not when I said good morning that one time. I had attributed it to being the kind of person who kept to herself. I had built an entire explanation around that single observation, and I had never questioned it. Sandra asked if I was sure the voice was coming from that apartment. I said yes. She looked at the ceiling, or in the direction of the ceiling, as if checking something. Then she looked back at me and did not say anything, which was somehow the most unsettling response she could have given. I told her I was going to try to contact the building office. She said that was probably a good idea, and gave me a look that I recognized, the look of someone who wants to be helpful, but does not want to be further involved. I did not blame her for that. I thanked her. She went inside, and the deadbolt turned behind her within about 3 seconds. I stood in the hallway for a while after that. The understanding of what I had been doing settled in slowly and not pleasantly. For weeks, I had been talking through my ceiling to something I could not identify, something that had known my name, something that had mimicked the patterns and rhythms of a woman who was incapable of producing them, something that had stood at my door at 2 a.m. and sung, with its mouth very close to the wood, while the hallway in front of my door remained empty, and it was still up there. There is a specific kind of knowledge that does not feel like knowledge right away. It feels more like a change in air pressure, the way a room feels different before a storm that has not arrived yet. You are aware that something has shifted, but the shift is too large to process all at once, so your mind handles it in pieces, slowly, over time, feeding it to you in amounts that you can absorb without completely coming apart. That is what the 2 days after talking to Sandra were like. And I went to work. I came home. I ate. I slept badly. On the surface, the routine held. Underneath it, I was doing a continuous, quiet calculation, running the same information through the same loop and arriving at the same place every time, which was nowhere comfortable. Something had been living above me, not Mrs. Varelli. Something that had access to her apartment, that had been there long enough to know my name, long enough to learn the specific rhythms of my evenings, the sounds I made and what they meant. It had learned me the way you learn a place you have occupied for a long time, by proximity and repetition and attention. It knew when I was in the kitchen. It knew when I had gone to bed. It knew, somehow, whether I was standing on a table or not. That last part I kept returning to. The detail about the table. On the night I banged on the ceiling, I had climbed up to reach it, and the voice had guessed that immediately. I had assumed it was a reasonable inference that anyone living directly above a shorter than average ceiling might guess that a person would need height to reach it. That was the reading I had given it at the time, because it was the reading that allowed me to stay comfortable. But there was another reading, one I had been avoiding, which was that it had not guessed, that it had known because it could see. I did not go to the vent immediately. I want to be honest about that. I knew the vent was there, the standard issue metal grate above the kitchen sink that I had never thought about beyond a vague awareness that it existed. I knew, in the abstract, that vents connected things, that buildings breathe through them, that the space between floors in an old construction like mine is not solid. I knew all of that, and I did not go to the vent. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I would handle it through the proper channels, the building office, the daughter, the appropriate people with the appropriate authority. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of what I would find. So instead, I wrote the letter. I spent most of one evening drafting it, which is a strange thing to describe. A grown man sitting at his kitchen table, composing a letter to his elderly neighbor about the possibility that something was living in her apartment and using her as a cover. It felt absurd, even as I was doing it. The language kept coming out either too alarming or not alarming enough, and I had to keep finding the middle register, the one that would communicate the seriousness without causing a panic. She was in her 60s. She lived alone. She could not hear and could not speak, which meant that whatever was up there, she had no way of knowing it was there, and no way of calling for help if she found out. I kept the letter short. I told her that I had been hearing noises from her apartment at night, television and footsteps and sounds that I did not think she was making. I told her that I had been having conversations with someone I had believed was her, before learning that she was deaf and mute. I told her the voice had come to my door. I told her to contact her daughter and the building office, and to do it quietly, without making it obvious she had been warned. I did not mention the singing. I did not think it would help. I planned to slip it under her door when I knew she was out walking the dog. The timing would need to be right. She went out before dawn, as far as I could tell from watching her in the parking lot, which meant I would need to be up and ready, which on consecutive nights of bad sleep was not a straightforward thing to guarantee. In the meantime, the voice kept talking to me. This is the part I find most difficult to describe accurately, because the temptation is to make it sound more dramatic than it actually was in the moment, And the truth of it is that the moments themselves were quiet and almost mundane, which was precisely what made them difficult to handle. It did not scream through the ceiling. It did not make threats. It talked to me the way it had always talked to me, in the same dry, unhurried register, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not stood at my front door 2 nights ago with my heart running at double speed, listening to it sing. One night, it said something about my keys. A low, casual observation slipped in between the ordinary sounds of the building, asking if I had moved them, or if it had. The sentence landed and sat there. I did not respond. I stood very still in the kitchen and waited for it to say something else, but there was nothing after that, just the normal silence. Another night, it told me I looked tense. It said something about the ceiling being heavy that day. The phrasing was odd, particular. The ceiling being heavy. I turned that over for a long time. It was not threatening language in any obvious way, but it suggested a level of awareness, a specificity of observation that made my scalp tighten. A third night, I was standing at the kitchen counter making tea, and it said that it could see my shoulders stiffening up. It said I was pretending not to hear it again, and then it was quiet. I put the kettle down and did not move for several minutes. I had been careful, after Sandra told me what she told me, not to respond to the ceiling, not to knock, not to call back, not to give any signal that would confirm I had been told something it did not want me to know. I had been operating on the assumption that the safest version of this situation was one in which I played out the ordinary routine while I figured out how to resolve it through other channels. Keep the temperature low. Do not create a reason for whatever was up there to change its behavior. The line about my shoulders made me less sure of that plan. If it could see me, then it already knew. The silence I was maintaining was not neutral. It was being observed and interpreted in real time by something that had been watching me, possibly for a long time. I called the building administrator's office the next morning. The woman who answered was pleasant, in the way that administrative offices are pleasant when they are not really listening to you. A practiced warmth that does not extend below the surface. I told her I had a serious concern about the apartment above me. I told her I believed there was an intruder in the building, possibly living in the space between floors, and that the tenant in the apartment above me was elderly and vulnerable and not able to seek help for herself. I told her this as clearly and directly as I could, without embellishment, because I had learned from watching people react to this information that the embellishments were the parts that made them stop taking it seriously. She asked if I thought the apartment was haunted. She said it lightly, as if it were a reasonable thing to ask, as if I might say yes, and she would know exactly which form to file. I told her it was not a joke. I told her there was a person or persons in that apartment who were not supposed to be there, and that the resident herself had no way of knowing. She said she would contact the daughter and have her come by to check. She said it in the way people say things when they are trying to end a conversation. I pressed her on the timeline. She said she would do it soon. I told her that soon was not a specific enough answer, given what I had described to her. She told me she had already answered my call outside of office hours, and that I should be grateful she had picked up at all. I raised my voice. Not significantly, not unreasonably, but enough to feel the change in my own chest, the way frustration escapes before you mean to release it. I stopped myself and pulled the phone slightly away from my ear and took a breath. The apartment was very quiet around me. I had been pacing while I talked, which I always do on the phone, and I was standing near the middle of the living room. I lowered my voice and told her to please follow up as soon as possible. She said she would. We ended the call. I stood in the silence of the apartment for a moment, still holding the phone. Then, from above my head, a sound. Not the normal footsteps. Not the television. This was heavier and more sudden. The kind of sound that a building makes when something large shifts inside it unexpectedly. A single dense impact that I felt as much as heard, somewhere in the soles of my feet through the floorboards. The plaster dust in the light above me moved slightly. Then came the scrambling. Frantic movement, the kind that has no pattern, no direction. Just the sound of something covering ground fast, without planning how. Heavy furniture displaced, the groan and scrape of something dense being moved across hardwood, not being slid, but being forced. Then glass, something breakable hitting the floor above me with the particular sound that glass makes, which is not like any other sound, which does not need context to be understood. I had gone completely still. The dog started. The little terrier that Mrs. Varelli walked every morning, that I had seen pulling at the leash in the parking lot below, began to bark, but not the way dogs bark at a stranger or a noise that startles them. The way dogs bark when they are past the point of warning and into the point of something else entirely. High and relentless and escalating in a way that had no pause in it. I stood in my living room with the phone still in my hand, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that whatever was happening above me had not started when I heard the first impact. I had been on the phone. I had been raising my voice, and the noise from the apartment above had been building for some amount of time while I was occupied with my own voice, and by the time it had grown loud enough to cut through, it had already been happening. I do not know how to write about what came next except to write it plainly, because the plain version is already sufficient. Mrs. Varelli could not speak. That was the established fact. She could not form words, but the sounds that came through my ceiling in the next 20 or 30 seconds were human sounds, the kind of sounds that a person makes when the body is producing them without the involvement of language. Low and formless and continuous, with a quality of desperation that did not require translation. She could not call for help. She could not name what was happening to her. All she could produce was the sound of pure animal terror from a body that was not capable of anything more articulate than that. The movement above me continued for a short time, heavy and uneven. Then there was a single sound, sharp and dense and final, and after that, the movement stopped. The dog's barking dropped almost immediately into something smaller, a thin, broken sound that faded in intervals until the apartment above me was quiet. I was holding my phone. I had been holding it the entire time. I dialed the police and told them there was a woman in the apartment above mine and that something had happened to her and that they needed to come immediately. My voice was steady in a way that surprised me, the mechanical steadiness of shock, the voice that operates on its own while the rest of you is somewhere slightly behind it, watching. I put the phone down on the counter and stood in my kitchen and waited. The ceiling above me was completely silent. The police arrived in under 10 minutes, which felt both faster than I expected and much too late. I heard them in the stairwell first, the particular sound of multiple people moving quickly upstairs in hard-soled shoes, radios crackling in short bursts, the kind of controlled urgency that law enforcement carries with it as a matter of professional habit. I opened my front door before they reached my floor and directed them up. 2 officers went past me without stopping. A third paused long enough to ask if I was the one who called, and when I said yes, he told me to stay in my apartment and keep the door closed. I did not keep the door closed. I kept it open a few inches and stood just inside it. From the stairwell, I could hear them in the hallway above, voices in short, clipped exchanges, the kind of language that does not waste syllables. A door being tried, then a harder sound, a frame giving way. Then quiet, the specific quiet of people moving carefully through a space they do not know. I went back inside and sat on the couch. I did not have a clear sense of how much time passed after that. It was the kind of waiting where time does not behave normally, where 10 minutes and 40 minutes feel identical from the inside. I was aware of being cold despite the heat being on, and of a dry sensation in my mouth that did not go away when I drank water. At some point, I turned a lamp on because the dark felt worse than the light, though I could not have said exactly why. When the knock came at my door, it was one of the officers from earlier, the one who had told me to stay inside. He asked me to walk him through what I had heard. I told him everything, starting from the first impact and the scrambling and ending with the sounds Mrs. Varelli had made and the silence that followed them. He listened without writing anything down initially, which I noticed, and then partway through he took out a small notepad and began. He asked a few clarifying questions, practical ones, about timing and what I had been doing immediately before I heard the noise. He did not ask about the voice through the ceiling or the weeks of conversation or the knock at my door, because I had not volunteered any of that, and he had not asked. He told me they had found the resident of the upstairs apartment. He said it with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that the other person already understands. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. He told me someone would be in touch and went back upstairs. It was about an hour later that they brought her out. I know the word "her" is confusing in that sentence, and I want to be precise. The woman they brought through the lobby was not Mrs. Varelli. She was younger, or looked younger, though in the state she was in, it was genuinely difficult to say. Her hair was matted and pressed flat against one side of her head in a way that suggested it had been that way for a long time, not recently. Her skin was pale in the specific way that skin becomes pale when it has not seen adequate light for an extended period, not the ordinary pallor of someone who works indoors, but something deeper and more settled into the tissue. She was barefoot on the lobby tile. Her clothes were too small for her, not dramatically, but enough to notice, the cuffs of her sleeves stopping several centimeters short of her wrists, the fabric across her shoulders pulled tight. She was bleeding from somewhere on her face, though not heavily. The officers had her by each arm, and she was moving with them but not cooperatively, not resisting exactly, just moving at her own pace in her own way, as if the people holding her were incidental to her trajectory. She looked at me as they passed. I was standing near the mailboxes, and I had not intended to be there. I had come down to give the officers my full statement and had ended up positioned, by accident, in the direct path between the stairwell door and the building entrance. There was not enough room to step aside without making it obvious that I was stepping aside, and by the time I understood what was happening, she was already close enough that looking away would have felt worse than holding her gaze. She looked directly at me, and she smiled. Not a reflexive smile, not the brief, involuntary expression that crosses some people's faces when they are in shock. This was deliberate, considered, a slow, full expression that reached her eyes and stayed there, the kind of look that communicates something specific, something between satisfaction and recognition, as if she were completing a sentence that had been left open for a long time. I watched them take her through the front entrance and out into the dark. I gave my statement. I went back upstairs. I sat in my apartment and did not sleep. The news moved through the building the way news always moves through small buildings, through the particular channels of people who share walls and hallways, and who are now standing in those hallways at unusual hours because something has happened and being inside feels wrong. Within 24 hours, I knew what most of the building knew, and within 48, I had confirmed the parts that I had not been able to verify on my own. The woman they had taken out of the building was Mrs. Varelli's daughter. I will not use her real name. She had been identified through the building records and through the building administrator, who had, I noted, managed to make herself available very quickly once there were police involved. The daughter had visited the building. That was established, known to other residents. Ordinary. She had visited her mother. At some point, the visits had stopped being visits. The understanding of what that meant settled in over a day or two, in pieces. She had stopped leaving. At some point, she had simply remained in the apartment with her mother, in a situation that no one in the building had identified because the resident was not capable of indicating that anything was wrong, and because the ordinary sounds of occupation, television and footsteps and noise at odd hours had been absorbed by the people around her as the ordinary noise of an older woman's irregular schedule. She had been there for months, possibly longer. I thought about the children's channels at 2 a.m. I thought about the stomping that had no pattern. I thought about what I had told myself those things were. There was something I could not set down. It stayed with me through the process of giving statements and answering follow-up questions and watching the building return, with unsettling speed, to its ordinary rhythms. The ceiling above me was now quiet in a way it had not been since the autumn. The television did not come on. The footsteps did not come. The voice did not come. The building was processing the event the way buildings process things, by absorbing it and continuing. But there was something that did not resolve. The voice had known I was standing on the table. Not guessed. I had accepted the guess reading for weeks, but I was no longer confident in it. It had known I was tense. It had known my shoulders were stiffening. It had referenced seeing me, not hearing me, seeing. The choice of that word. It had been casual about it, which was the thing that had allowed me to receive it casually. but the casualness of a delivery does not change the content. I had been watched, consistently, over a period of weeks, from somewhere in my apartment that I had not identified. I knew about the vent. I had always known about the vent in the abstract way you know about the architecture of a place you live, the fixtures and openings and functional elements that you interact with so rarely they become invisible. The metal grate above the kitchen sink, flush with the ceiling, the kind of standard residential ductwork that exists in every apartment building of this age and type. I stood in the kitchen and looked at it for a long time before I did anything else. The grate was about 9 feet up. I got the step stool from the closet, the one I used for the higher kitchen shelves, and positioned it below the vent. I took the metal flashlight from the junk drawer in the counter, the heavy one I kept for power outages, and I stepped up. The grate was not screwed in. That is what I noticed first, before anything else. There were 4 corner screws, the kind with slotted heads that require a flathead screwdriver to turn, and they were all present, all seated in their holes, but none of them were engaged. They were just resting in the holes and held in place by their own weight and the slight friction of the frame. The grate lifted when I put 2 fingers under its lower edge and pulled gently. I set it aside on the counter and clicked the flashlight on. The smell reached me before the light showed me anything. It was layered, the way confined smells become layered over time. The top note sharp and chemical, ammonia, and underneath it, something organic and stale. The smell of a space that has been occupied for a long time by something that was not keeping it clean. I had smelled something faintly in my kitchen over the past several weeks, not strongly enough to identify, not often enough to investigate, and I had attributed it without much thought to the building's general age. Old buildings have smells. You stop noticing them. I directed the beam into the opening. The crawl space between my ceiling and the floor above was approximately 2 feet high, which is less than it sounds. Not a space you could sit upright in, a space you could lie flat in, or move through on your stomach if you were motivated. The floor of it was the top surface of my ceiling, old plaster reinforced with wooden slats, and the ceiling of it was the underside of Mrs. Varelli's floorboards, dark with age and dust. The flashlight moved over the contents slowly, because my hand was not steady. A sleeping bag, military surplus by the look of it, I flattened to almost nothing from long use, pushed against the near wall. Next to it, a collection of empty cans, the pull-tab kind, the kind you do not need a tool to open, 7 or 8 of them pushed into a rough pile. 3 plastic water bottles, the large kind, standing upright and filled with liquid that the flashlight showed me was dark yellow. A pillow, positioned at the far edge of the sleeping bag, with its open end facing down through a gap in the plaster. The plaster directly above the pillow had been worked open. Not broken, not damaged, worked. The edges of the gap were smooth and deliberate, the plaster removed in careful pieces over time, leaving an opening roughly the size of a dinner plate. Through that opening, from that position, lying on the sleeping bag with the pillow below you, you would have a direct and unobstructed view of my kitchen counter, my kitchen table, the space between the counter and the refrigerator where I stood when I was on the phone. I stayed on the step stool and held the flashlight steady, and looked at what I was looking at and tried to build a complete picture of the timeline. How long the sleeping bag had been there. How long the bottles had been filling. How many nights the opening had been used. Weeks at minimum. More likely months. The construction of the gap in the plaster was not rushed work. It was patient work, done incrementally by someone who understood that the pace of the work was as important as the work itself. I moved the flashlight beam toward the back of the crawl space, into the darker section where the ductwork narrowed and turned, expecting to confirm what I already believed, that the space was empty now, that it had been emptied when the daughter was taken out of the building. The beam found a pair of eyes. They were open and unblinking, and they were looking directly at me, and the particular flat reflective quality of eyes caught in a direct light source, wide and still. They were set in a face that was completely bald, no hair at all, pale in a way that the flashlight made look almost gray. The body attached to the face was pressed back against the far corner of the crawl space, between two support beams, knees pulled toward the chest, dressed in a gray sweater that was several sizes too large, completely motionless except for a slight rise and fall in the chest. I did not move. The figure did not move. For a period of time that I cannot accurately estimate, because my sense of time had stopped functioning normally, we remained in that configuration. Me on the step stool with the flashlight, the figure in the corner with the unblinking eyes, the crawl space between us, 2 feet high and filled with the smell of long occupation. Then it moved, not slowly, not with any of the stiffness you would expect from a person who had been compressed into a 2-foot space for any length of time. It moved the way things move when they have been still for so long that the stillness was not rest but preparation. Fast and flat on its stomach, propelling itself forward with its arms, crossing the length of the crawl space before I had finished processing that it had started moving. It came through the vent opening head first, and it came fast, and it hit me in the chest before I had time to step off the stool, and we went down together onto the kitchen floor, the flashlight spinning away under the counter, the room dropping into the ambient dark of a city apartment at night, and whatever else was going to happen in that dark. There is a particular quality to physical fear that is different from the fear you feel in anticipation of something. Anticipatory fear has texture to it. It gives you time to narrate, to construct a version of what is happening that you can hold at a slight distance and examine. It allows a part of your mind to stay observational, to take notes, to monitor itself, monitoring the situation. It is still fear, but it is fear with room in it. What replaced it when we hit the kitchen floor together was something that had no room in it at all. There was no narration. There was no observation. There was only the immediate and total fact of another body on top of mine, dense and disorganized, elbows and knees finding surfaces they should not have found. The smell of the crawl space transferred directly to my face at close range. My back hit the linoleum hard enough to empty my lungs. Not painful yet. That would come later. Just suddenly and completely airless, the body's response to impact before the nervous system has caught up to it. He was not large. That was the thing that surprised me in the seconds before surprise became irrelevant. He was not a large person. The gray sweater had suggested bulk, but the bulk was fabric, and the body inside it was narrow and angular, all bone and gristle, the kind of body that has been running on the minimum for a long time. But weight is not the same as size, and he was heavy in the way that dead weight is heavy, the particular density of a body that is not organizing itself cooperatively, that is just present and pressing. His hands found my face before I could get my arms up. Not a grip, not a deliberate hold, just the frantic, undirected contact of someone moving fast in the dark without a specific plan, fingers dragging across my jaw and cheekbone. I got both forearms up between us and pushed, which created enough space to try to roll, but he moved with the roll without resistance, as if he had anticipated it, or as if anticipating things was not something he was doing at all, and he was simply responding to contact the way water responds to pressure, filling whatever space presented itself. I got a hand on his collarbone and pushed hard. He made no sound. That was the detail that my mind kept returning to, even as the rest of me was occupied with more immediate concerns. No grunting, no verbal response, nothing that indicated effort or pain or any of the sounds that humans make in physical exertion. Just movement. Continuous, directionless, relentless movement in the dark. I threw a punch at roughly where his head should have been and connected with something that felt like the top of a shoulder. He did not react to it. Not a flinch, not a change in the quality of the movement. Nothing that suggested the impact had registered as information. I hit him again, harder, aiming lower, and felt the contact clearly in my knuckles, but observed zero effect. Then he bit me. It was my left forearm, which I had across my chest in a defensive position. He found it in the dark with a precision that everything else about him had not suggested he was capable of, and he bit down with a steadiness and commitment that was not frantic. The frantic part had been the lunging and the crawling and the landing. The bite was different. The bite was deliberate, and the pain was immediate and specific and very clean, the way certain kinds of pain are clean, not the dull, spreading pain of a bruise or a strain, but a bright, contained signal from a precise location that traveled up my arm to my shoulder in under a second, and sat there. I made a sound. I am not entirely sure what sound. Something involuntary. I started hitting the side of his head with my free hand, not aiming, just landing whatever I could land. 4 times, 5 times. The heel of my palm rather than my knuckles because my fingers had closed involuntarily, and opening them was not something I could prioritize at that moment. He did not release on the first hit, or the second, or the third. He released on the 4th or 5th, not because of the impact I thought, but because it was time. Because whatever the bite had been for was finished. He immediately moved to my throat. His hands, both of them, found my neck in the dark with the same uncomfortable precision the bite had shown. Not squeezing yet, just placed, the way you place a hand on a surface to feel what it is before deciding what to do with the information. I got my knee up between us and drove it into his midsection as hard as I could from the position I was in, which was not hard enough, but it was enough to shift his center of gravity backward and break the placement of his hands. I rolled away from him and got to one knee and stayed there, breathing. He was somewhere in the kitchen. I could not see him. The flashlight was under the counter, and its beam was pointing at the cabinet base and throwing just enough scattered light to establish that the room was a kitchen and that there were shapes in it, but not enough to tell me where he was specifically. I could hear him, a slight sound of movement on the linoleum, but movement without direction that I could identify. I reached back and got my hand on the counter edge and stood up. The pain in my forearm had expanded from the initial clean signal into something larger and less defined, a deep throbbing that had spread to my elbow and was working upward. The sleeve of my shirt was wet. I kept my weight on both feet and my back against the counter and stayed still, listening. The movement on the linoleum stopped. The apartment was very quiet. Then the door came in. Not a knock, not the door being opened, on the door coming in. The particular explosive sound of a door being forced from outside by people who have the equipment and the training and the intention to move through it as fast as possible. The frame cracked. The door swung hard and hit the wall, and the kitchen filled with light, tactical lights mounted on weapons, the specific high-intensity white that makes you feel like every surface in the room has been simultaneously overexposed. Voices, multiple and simultaneous, overlapping in the way law enforcement voices overlap in an entry. Not chaotic, but structured. A managed layering of commands that covers the room in all directions at once. I heard my own name and the instruction to show my hands, and I raised both of them, the right one immediately, and the left one a half-second behind, because the arm did not respond as quickly as I intended it to. 2 officers moved past me to the figure on the floor. He had not tried to run. He had not moved toward the door or the vent or any other exit point when the door came in. He was on the kitchen floor in approximately the position he had been in when I lost track of him, and when the officers reached him and took hold of him, he did not cooperate, but he also did not fight in any way that had strategy to it. He thrashed. He made the same absence of sound he had made during the entire encounter. No words, no recognizable language, nothing that indicated he was processing the situation the way a person processes a situation. He snapped his teeth at one of the officers, and the officer moved his hand back quickly and said something to his partner that I did not catch. They got him cuffed and upright. He was standing between 2 officers in my kitchen under the tactical lights, and I could see him clearly for the first time. He was bald in the complete way, not shaved, but absent. No eyebrows, no lashes, the skin of his scalp and face uniformly pale in a way that suggested a very long time away from natural light. His eyes, which had been wide and flat in the flashlight beam of the crawl space, were the same now, open without being alert, present without being focused. He was looking at the wall to his left with the particular expression of someone who is not looking at anything. He was not who I had been listening to through the ceiling. I understood that immediately and completely. Whatever the voice was, whatever had learned my name and my routines and my habits and had stood at my door and sung to me through the wood, it was not this person. This person did not look capable of that kind of sustained, calibrated interaction. He did not look capable of language at all. He was something else entirely, a different category of presence. A presence that had been in the crawl space above my kitchen for purposes I could not fully reconstruct and did not want to. The officers took him out. Someone put a hand on my shoulder and directed me toward the couch, and I sat down. An officer knelt in front of me and looked at my forearm, the bite, and told me I needed to go to the hospital and get it cleaned and assessed. He said it with professional matter-of-factness, the voice of someone who has delivered this specific instruction before and will deliver it again. I looked down at my arm. The bite was clean-edged, which sounds like a positive thing and is not. A ragged bite tears at the surface. A clean bite means the jaw closed with purpose and held. There were 2 clear arcs of broken skin, upper and lower, through the fabric of my sleeve, which had not protected me at all. The bleeding was not dramatic, but it was consistent. The slow, persistent bleed of a wound that is not going to stop without intervention. I told the officer I would go. He asked if I had someone who could take me. I said yes, which was not true, and then I called a car and sat on my couch and waited for it. In the days that followed, the building delivered its version of the complete story in the same way it had delivered everything else, in pieces, through the specific channels of a small residential community that has experienced a shared event and is collectively processing it. The daughter, it emerged, had not simply stopped leaving. The fuller picture was worse than the version I had constructed. She had been living in that apartment with her mother for the better part of 8 months. The building records showed her listed as an emergency contact, which gave her a plausible reason to be present and a cover for the occasions when other residents saw her. She had maintained just enough surface normalcy to avoid triggering the kind of concern that leads to action. She paid her mother's rent remotely. She managed the limited contact that Mrs. Varelli's life required. She made herself legible as a concerned daughter doing what concerned daughters do. Whatever had been happening in that apartment during those 8 months, the specifics of it were not shared with me, and I did not seek them out. There are categories of information that you understand, once you have gotten close to their edges, are better left at the edge. The bald man was not identified to me directly. I heard from another resident, secondhand, that he had been found to have no documentation, no records that could be located quickly, no identification on his person. Whether that was the end of the investigation into who he was, I do not know. I was not kept informed of the process in any systematic way. I was a neighbor who had heard something and called the police. My role in the official version of events was specific and limited. What I was left with, in the quiet of my apartment in the days after, was not the events themselves. The events had a shape. They had a sequence. You could lay them out in order and follow them from the beginning to the end and understand how one thing had led to another. That kind of understanding, the narrative kind, is something the mind reaches for automatically because it provides the sensation of resolution. But the sensation of resolution and actual resolution are not the same thing. The voice through the ceiling had known things that required observation to know. The bald man in the crawl space had provided the observation. That was the explanation I had arrived at, and it was the explanation that held up logically that the two had been working together, that one had watched and one had spoken, that the dynamic banter and the dry humor and the patient calibration of the ceiling conversations had been produced by the daughter from somewhere in the apartment above, informed in real time by what the man in the crawl space could see through the gap in the plaster. It was a complete explanation. It covered the evidence. I applied it, and it stayed in place for about 2 days. Then I started to find the edges of it. The timing was the first edge. On the night of the knock at my door, the night of the singing, I had watched the hallway through my peephole for a long time and had seen nothing. The daughter would have needed to travel from the apartment above, down the stairwell, to my floor, and then back, all without appearing in the section of hallway my peephole covered, in all without producing the sounds that movement in an old building at that hour invariably produces. It was not impossible. The stairwell door was outside my peephole's range. She could have moved against the wall beneath the peephole's downward angle. These explanations were available, but the voice had been directly behind my door, not from the direction of the stairwell, not muffled by the distance between the stairwell door and my unit. It had been close and direct and immediate, and the voice of someone whose mouth was inches from the wood. The second edge was the sentence about the keys. She had asked if I had moved them, or if she had, not whether I had moved them. Whether she had. The construction of the sentence was specific. It suggested the possibility of her own agency in my apartment, in my kitchen, in the space where I kept my keys. I had noted it at the time and filed it as strange phrasing and moved on, because moving on had been the easier option. Now I turned it over more carefully. The third edge I did not allow myself to examine for very long, because the edges of certain things are sufficient and the interior does not need to be visited. The bald man in the crawlspace had been above my kitchen. He had been positioned to see my kitchen and nothing else. The gap in the plaster was a kitchen-sized gap, oriented toward the counter and the table and the space near the refrigerator. A fixed observation point. My bedroom was not the kitchen. My bathroom was not the kitchen. The bathroom, specifically, had its own vent. I had never looked at the bathroom vent. I had not thought about it. It was a smaller grate, the standard residential size, flush with the bathroom ceiling above the mirror. I had looked at myself in that mirror every day for 3 years, in the ordinary, oblivious way that you look at yourself in a mirror, not thinking about the space above the ceiling, not thinking about the space above your own reflection. I thought about the song, Quiet Feet on Bathroom Tile. Mirror holds you for a while. Lights are off, but eyes still see. Something standing where you would be. I sat in my apartment and listened to the silence above me, and considered whether the silence was the absence of occupation or simply the absence of sound, and I understood that I did not have a reliable way to distinguish between those two things. I had never had a reliable way to distinguish between them. I had been operating for months on the assumption that the silence meant one thing, and every time that assumption had been wrong, the wrongness had arrived in a form that was already past the point of being useful. I am writing this from my apartment. The ceiling above me has been quiet for 6 days. The building has returned to its ordinary sounds, the elevator, the pipes, the specific creak of the third step in the stairwell that I have heard 10,000 times. I went to the hospital and had the bite cleaned and closed and assessed. They asked me a set of questions that are standard for animal bites, and I answered them. They gave me a course of antibiotics and scheduled a follow-up and sent me home. The antibiotics are making me nauseous. That is what I have been telling myself. I came home from the follow-up appointment 2 days ago and stood in my kitchen for a while before I could make myself move through the rest of the apartment. I stood under the vent, which had been replaced and properly screwed into its frame by a maintenance worker the building sent up the morning after. 4 screws, tightened correctly, seated in their holes with the friction of actual engagement. I told myself that was sufficient. Then I went to the bathroom. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror in the ordinary way, the way I have looked at myself every day for 3 years. And I did not look at the vent above me, the small grate flush with the bathroom ceiling, the one I had not examined and had not thought about and had not included in any version of the accounting I had done. I brushed my teeth. I turned the light off. I went to bed. The ceiling above my bedroom was quiet. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, and I listened to the building settle into the particular silence it reaches at that hour. The compressed and total silence that I have always found, until recently, to be one of the more reliable comforts of living alone. The knowledge that the quiet belongs to you, that the dark is your dark. I have been lying here for 3 hours. The nausea has not improved. And a few minutes ago, from the direction of the bathroom, I heard the very small and very specific sound of a metal grate being set carefully down on a tile floor. I have not moved. I am still listening.